Hello, friends. Today is December 13th, and our story begins in 1865 when a little boy named George was born. Now, George was born, he was born into a Protestant family, and back in those days, church music was organ and choirs. That's what Protestant music was. And when George was 7 years old, they visited him and his family. They visited just this gigantic church, and George was fascinated. He was fascinated by the beauty. He was fascinated by the music. He loved it. He asked if he could play the organ, and so the organist gently, agreed. And so George went up there, and they were really expecting George just to make, random notes like a 7-year-old would. But instead, it was beautiful music. And so at that moment, people kind of fawned over him, and his dad decided definitely have to get a musical education for my son, George. So he bought him an organ. He got him a music teacher from his local church, but there was a problem. Frederick, which was the musician from the local church, he was an alcoholic, just be blunt, and many times he wasn't in a condition to play at church. And soon, little George, 7 years old and growing up, pretty soon he'd taken over most of Frederick's church work. George grew up, and when he was 19, his father died. And George took it really, really hard. He left, he went to university, burying his grief in his work. Then he went to Italy, and in Italy, things just took off for him. He became a master of Italian opera. And I know that doesn't sound to us very appealing, but in his day, it was all of the rage. And to the point where Prince George, when George was 25, he met Prince George, who was in Germany at the time, and actually they became friends. And Prince George sponsored George the musician. And when Prince George became George the First of England, he asked George to come with him and to be a musician in England. And so he did. So George finds himself, he's got this salary, he's got all kinds of accolades, he's got a borrowed castle to live in, he's famous, he's living lavishly because of all of the Italian operas he's writing. And George was overly concerned with his status, with his wealth, with what people thought of him, his reputation. Music was great, but part of it was that music was his path to fame and fortune. Now, in all of his dealings, because he really liked to socialize, he met a man named Charles. Charles was very wealthy, but he was a very serious kind of guy, a rule follower to the extreme. And he was the same way with his faith. He was a very staunch believer. He loved the Lord. He knew his Bible, very set in his ways. And he saw how society was shifting in the early 1700s, and he did not like how he saw parts of it shifting away from God. So he did this gigantic Bible study on Jesus, from Genesis to Revelation. And he gathered up all of the relevant scriptures, and he thought, if I can just get people to pay attention to the scripture, society would turn back to God. And he thought that should center on Jesus. So again, he went through Genesis all the way to Revelation and wrote down from the King James Bible and a couple of other resources all of the scriptures regarding Jesus, how it was foretold he would be born, what his nativity, his life, his death, his resurrection, and also his second coming. So he wrote this all down, and then he went to his friend George. And Charles tells George, I want this set to music. I want this to be a big, nice piece. And it was kind of that classic, I have a great idea that you need to do. And George is not impressed. This is not where he's at. This doesn't fit with Italian opera at all, although Italian opera was falling out of fashion and George was having to do English stuff now. But he didn't like it at all. So he put it on a shelf and it remained there. It remained there for a year and a half. But a lot had happened in that year and a half. George had softened a little bit. He'd been doing a lot more work in English as opposed to Italian. He'd had some success with a few Bible stories. And so he was looking around for a new idea, and he finally took Charles's manuscript off the shelf. And then he began to read through it and he decided, maybe this is something worth looking at. And so he takes out his pen and his staff paper, and he begins to write. And he begins to write so quickly that he records later, his pencil, so it wasn't a pen, it was a pencil, barely kept up with his mind. He was going. 24 days. He just kept going. And when he was done, when he wrote that last note, he started sobbing. What he had read and what had come out of his pencil, that music, that had touched some deep part of him. And he felt that he had been moved by the Lord to do that. He knew that seemed beyond his capacity to put that kind of music out in that short of time, this majestic, how he was imagining it. So when he put it down, he just sobbed. He was, in actuality, a changed man. And he understood now more than ever that Christ had come to rescue mankind. And he resolved from that point on that he was going to stop pursuing fame and money and reputation. He wanted to put his gifts to higher uses. And he soon got his chance. The Duke of Devonshire asked him to do a charity show in Ireland to raise money to pay off debts for those that were in debtor's prison. The idea is if you pay off the debts of those in debtor's prison, they'd be free, and this cycle of debt and prison would break. And so George accepted, and it was going to feature that new music he had written. He didn't even tell Charles. He just went off. But before he did, he brought a singer with him. And this was kind of a strange choice, because this singer, her name was Suzanne. And Suzanne, she was a soloist, she was an actress, very good at what she did, but everybody despised her. She had shows that were packed, and then what happened is that backstory on Suzanne. She was married very, very young, forced into that marriage, and it was an unhappy marriage, and she was beaten. This guy was abusive. And so she ran away into the arms of another man, and then got accused of adultery, and it was paraded through the newspapers. So instead of her basically fleeing an abusive husband into the arms of another man, it came across to the public as if she was just this horrible, horrible person. And she was absolutely despised. And so her shows were now empty. So George offers her a job, and she says, yeah, she's going. George later said he selected Suzanne because he thought there was no woman in all of England who needed the message of the music more than Suzanne. So Charles, who wrote the Bible study, he heard what George was doing over in Ireland, and he brought Suzanne with him, that he's going to play this music that was based on what George had handed him early. He's upset. He writes a letter saying, you should not do this. This music needs to be done, in a special way. And he was upset because George was going to do it in this big theater. It wasn't even a church. And so he's angry at Susan, that Susan's going to be there. He's angry that it's in a theater. He's angry. He's just angry. And so he dashes off this letter. But George decides to do it anyway. He's going with plan A. He's going to do it with Susan. He's going to do it within the theater. And so he does. The theater in Devonshire, it's packed for a debut. It's a one-night only thing. Some are just curious. Some are critics of Suzanne and just want to see her blow it. Some want to hear George's new music. But it's a fundraiser. And so that part was good. And so the music begins. And Suzanne begins to sing. And the crowd is in awe. They listen and listen, and there's none of the shouts and the critiques that some people were worried about because of who Suzanne was. It was just amazing. The crowd was totally captivated. And at the end, one of Suzanne's most vocal critics, one of the newspapermen who wrote against her, stood up in the crowd and said that she must have received forgiveness from God to be able to have sang like that. Her career was redeemed, and people were just in awe. Instead of it being a one night only, they had another performance and another one. The show carried on for months. 150 people were released from debtor's prison because of all the money that had been raised by the show. And George is a changed man. He didn't accept a penny for himself. He paid the orchestra and the chorus, and of course Suzanne and the theater, all of his expenses responsibly, but he didn't take any money himself. It was no longer about fame and fortune. And he got he had got a discussion with Charles, one who had written all of this and was angry with him. But Charles was no longer angry because as he observed things, as he heard things in the newspaper, he saw that God's plan had been greater than his own. But he did want to see the music moved back to London so people could enjoy it there. So they did it in a few churches, and it was a decent response, but rather tepid compared to what they had in Devonshire. But George himself, he wasn't comfortable with it just being in churches. And what had happened was, the next thing that happened was this, is that there was a man named Thomas Crown. Thomas Crown had opened a hospital in London. And London in those days was it was a rough place. It was a very happening place. In other words, it was booming. And what would happen is that young girls would go there looking for a job, and they would be preyed upon by rich men promising to make them their wives, and they would and basically these young girls, they would get pregnant, and once they got pregnant, the rich men would ghost them. And so at the point where Thomas Crown started his hospital, 1,000 babies a year were being found on the streets of London dead. Either the girls would abandon the babies because they couldn't take care for them, or they tried to take care for them and the baby died and there was no funds to take care of a body. And so it was just brutal stuff. And Thomas Crown couldn't handle it. So he opens this hospital, but the moment he opens this hospital, for babies, every bed is full and hundreds more are coming. And so the hospital's overwhelmed. It's in danger of shutting down for lack of funding. And George hears this. And so George asks Thomas, hey, can I hold a fundraiser for your hospital? And Thomas isn't going to say no. He needs it, right? So they get the biggest room at the hospital, and they start selling tickets. So many tickets are sold that they actually have to stop. It's just, the room's going to be too crowded. The women are told, don't wear hoop skirts, those big things that come out, because there's not going to be enough room for it. And so George, he gets everything ready. It's the day of the show, and George himself, he's going to conduct. And so he begins to conduct his music. And once again, it's the same thing. People are just in awe. It's an amazing piece of music. It just people are blown away. They're just wow. And the accolades that come from the newspapers afterwards are just amazing. The hospital raises enough money to stay open. And George makes a decision. He says the hospital is going to be the place where this music is played. If you want to hear this music, you're going to do it at the hospital. And that way, all of the money would go to sustaining Thomas Crown's hospital. The proceeds would always go there. Today, of course, things are a little different. George Frederick Handel's oratorio, or the Messiah, as you and I know that piece of music. It's one of the most recognized pieces of music in the entire world. It's often played during the Christmas season, especially the Hallelujah chorus. It's touched hearts for centuries, from Ireland to London and to really all the world. But the first heart that it touched was that of the composer himself, who realized that fame and fortune, reputation, was nothing compared to the importance of Jesus Christ. Grace and peace to you, my friends. Take care, and don't forget the important things this season.